There's been a lot of discussion on the Bird app recently, which is really just the latest development in the bitter standoff between Amtrak, the United States national passenger rail operator, and the Class 1 railways, affectionately known as the Big Ones. The Class 1 railways are the big North American freight railways, two of which call Canada home. You see, by and large, the Class 1 railways, which in Canada were historically and continue to be supported by a wide variety of government projects and public spending, despite being private companies, are incredibly hostile to passenger rail service, seeing it as a needless impediment on their profit-making power. But there's increasingly a lot of pushback against this. Most recently, when a Class 1 railway recently claimed that its rails near the Gulf of Mexico were simply too busy and full of trains to operate Amtrak service over them, Amtrak, who has become particularly and admirably spicy in recent years, set up a live stream of the empty railway tracks which were apparently full of trains and that they could not use, which was an amazing publicity thing. This leads us to one of the ultimate questions that gets posed in the world of transit and railways. Can freight and passenger trains operate in harmony? Let's talk about it. If you enjoy the videos I make, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. As it turns out, while you'll often hear exclamations from the freight railways that freight and passenger rail traffic are fundamentally incompatible, this isn't true. And not just in the sense that they could coexist, but it would be a disaster. We already successfully run freight and passenger trains on the same rails and corridors right here in North America, and do it properly. For one, the original O-Train line in Ottawa was designed to provide 15-minute frequency transit service for transit riders, while overnight having flip-up platform extenders that could allow freight trains to serve important industries. Another transit line that comes to mind when we talk about provision for local freight traffic is Waterloo's Ion Light rail system, over which a portion of the network freight trains operate on a weekly basis. And this doesn't even happen when electric trains are out of service. Trains on the section of track where the freight needs to operate simply pause for about 10 to 20 minutes, and then a freight train rolls through, not hitting the platforms thanks to infrastructure designed to help freight trains move around them, and not hitting the overhead catenary thanks to sensors which would automatically stop the train if it was over height. And it isn't just small, isolated local rail systems which do this. GO Transit now operates hourly service to one of Canada's largest cities through a massive, very busy freight rail junction. I covered that service in a video about a year ago, and it's likely to become as frequent as every half hour in the future, showing that you can definitely have freight and passenger rail interactions as long as you're designing and planning for it. At the same time, similar situations exist in the northeastern United States, as I'm sure many people are commenting down below. From the Lehigh line in New Jersey, which manages numerous freight and passenger trains every single day, to portions of the Northeast Corridor and SEPTA's regional rail network, which show quite clearly that you can still have standard North American freight, double-stacked containers and all, operating on a network that is electrified. Now, you shouldn't take these statements as me saying that freight and passenger trains could just operate on the same corridor anywhere willy-nilly. That's obviously not the case. But obviously the infrastructure barriers aren't nearly as big as often gets suggested, from the freight side or indeed sometimes even from the passenger side. So why is running freight and passenger trains so difficult here in North America? Well, the first issue you have to understand is that the priorities are legitimately flipped in North America. Here we do have a fundamentally successful freight rail network and a much less well-used continental passenger rail system. We have very profitable freight rail operations, which are incentivized to push back against any incursion into their territory, passenger or otherwise. And a lot of the time it's for simple reasons, like simply not wanting the responsibility to have to deal with trains that aren't carrying lumber, oil, or plastic toys from who knows where. But it's also because much of what made the modern, profitable model of freight rail possible are infrastructure changes specifically designed to make operating passenger trains more difficult. For one, the size of freight trains, as you probably know, is enormous in North America. It's not unusual to see hundreds of cars connected up in consists that can be multiple kilometers long. At the same time, the physical profile of freight trains in North America are very large, which can mean working with basic overhead electrification can be slightly more complicated than it would otherwise be. And the same is of course true with level boarding platforms. Of course, these things aren't fundamentally incompatible, but solutions to these problems are slightly more complicated than we're often interested in actually looking into. Usually a better solution is more complex and more expensive than the status quo, which usually kind of sucks, which is why our solutions usually kind of suck. Now, it can all be a bit deceiving too, because if you walk up to the average North American freight rail line, you might not even see a train, even if you wait for quite some time. And that's because, as I mentioned before, North America has a model of running freight trains which is focused on few, very, very large trains. So large indeed that several locomotives will pull each train, often with a locomotive in the center of the train as well. This means that trains don't have to be operated super often, and can be operated in more of a just-in-time model that is just simply not the way we think about traditional scheduled train traffic. At the same time, railway regulation in North America has long favored or pushed for reduced infrastructure. And that's on top of the already prevalent cost pressures on freight railways to reduce their infrastructure to reduce their infrastructure maintenance bills. While of course to some extent this has improved efficiency, it has also created innumerable problems, and an unabashedly worse rail network. For example, where long trains have become nightmares for towns with lots of grade crossings as they slowly crawl through, often dividing a city or town for 10 or 20 minutes at a time. There are also railways where super long freight trains are operated and sidings aren't even lengthened to accommodate such long freight trains, effectively massively reducing capacity but keeping maintenance costs low. The cutting back of railway capacity, very light touch regulation, and the big influence of the modern freight railways has turned our rail network in North America into a skeleton of its former self. And it's also made it much, much, much more dangerous. Tracks and infrastructure are rarely maintained to the standards of safety and quality that you would want for passenger trains. And if you've ridden a passenger train in North America, you might have noticed the ride tends to be quite uncomfortable. This is because fundamentally maintaining track is expensive, freight trains are heavy, which damage the track, they can operate slowly, and at the end of the day, they probably don't have all that many people on them, so safety is simply a lower priority. Of course, the cynical, but probably not entirely incorrect view is that part of the reason railways have ripped out so much infrastructure doesn't even come down to their operating model or their innovations. It comes down to them being able to quite simply and correctly say that their infrastructure simply can't support an attractive passenger service. It makes it really hard for a not super railway familiar politician, for example, to advocate for more passenger trains if their freight companies will simply say, "It's impossible." At the same time, freight railways have gone so far as to build new infrastructure, sometimes even funded with public dollars, that will make operating passenger trains in the future more difficult. Of course, if governments really desperately want passenger rail service, they'll probably be able to convince the freight railways to allow it, and they have been able to do this in numerous cities across North America. But usually all that we get is a few trains a day and for an exceptionally high price that goes to the freight railways, who of course get to determine the terms at which passenger trains can operate on their territory in most cases. Perhaps this is why most of the places where frequent passenger and freight rail manage to interact and interoperate fairly seamlessly is where the public agencies and passenger rail authorities have managed to buy up track from the freight railways. All of this means you'll see abandoned freight rail and railway corridors in general all across North America, and often even the rail corridors you will see will be downscaled from their former selves. One that's near where I live in Toronto has enough room for 4 tracks, but currently only has 1 or 2 in most places, because the freight companies have decided that they would rather not accommodate passenger trains, and they themselves really only need to operate a few very long trains on a regular basis. Now, if you were to ask a freight railway about this, they'd say that they've removed infrastructure to become more efficient and lean and fast. And that's true, but they've also become a one-trick pony, incapable of accommodating types of service that don't involve gigantic, lumbering freight trains. So while the railways have become really good at accommodating a large amount of freight, they've become absolutely incapable of operating a passenger service. In Europe and Asia, freight and passenger trains also operate together, but much more seamlessly than in North America. And it's not always an easy feat. For example, freight trains are one of the major barriers to implementing more advanced signaling technologies in Europe, as we talked about in a previous video, but there is still the desire to do that, even if it means overcoming the challenges. At the same time, in some places in the world, it's not uncommon to put some light freight on a passenger train, or even have a passenger train tow a little bit of freight along with it. A personal memory of mine is being in Tokyo and riding on the Yamanote line, one of, if not the most used urban rail line in the entire world, which moves more people by itself than most of the world's subway systems in their entire networks. And despite the Yamanote line having platform screen doors and high frequencies and all of that, I remember walking off a train once to see a freight train heading in the other direction. One of the most interesting examples of where freight and passenger trains manage to interoperate right here in North America is on Brightline, which just happens to be owned by a company which also previously owned the freight railway that Brightline operates over. As it turns out, when the freight rail company stands to benefit from passenger rail operations being successful, it seems like it's not a huge issue anymore. At the same time, now that Brightline operates so many frequent and fast trains over the infrastructure used by that freight railway, the numerous grade crossings and dangerous infrastructure on that railway are starting to become really obvious. And while the freight railway had operated this infrastructure for years or decades without feeling a need to improve it, I wouldn't be surprised if the passenger railway is the one that actually has to end up coughing up the money to make the fixes needed. Now, you're probably asking, what should we actually do? And here are a few things I would propose. For one, we need to drive a much harder bargain for passenger rail service, which has massive and well understood environmental, safety, and affordability benefits for the public. Freight railways need a lot from the government, and as I've mentioned before, they're often the beneficiaries, rightly so, of projects like grade separations and improved ports and infrastructure across our countries. These things should all be on the table for negotiating operating models that allow for more passenger service to serve the public, as well as the modification and creation of rail networks that are actually able to serve freight traffic, but also passenger traffic. If the freight railways are going to benefit from public dollars here, there, and everywhere, they should also be accommodating of the public interests when it comes to passenger rail. Fortunately, in many cases, bringing back better passenger rail and better passenger rail infrastructure to support it need not be expensive or super complicated, since we often have the right-of-way capacity, as I mentioned before. We also need to consider modifying our regulations to encourage building more capacious and flexible mixed-use railway corridors, especially in areas where freight traffic is light and passenger rail could easily be accommodated. Often accommodating passenger rail doesn't even require using the tracks used by freight trains, but simply using the same right-of-way or the wide ribbons of land used by the freight railway companies, which is something we've actually done right here in Toronto, where dedicated GO tracks exist in some places directly parallel to dedicated freight tracks. At the same time, we can look to countries like China and India, and right here at home as well, and build entirely new passenger corridors in places where we'll see major capacity and speed improvement benefits, and also where freight tracks are so congested that it actually makes sense to build dedicated passenger ones. Another economic lever we can use to help fund this is further regulating the trucking industry, which has long competed with the freight rail industry but is less environmentally friendly and less labor efficient. At the same time, there's no need to go back to the status quo of the past. Modern technologies from other parts of the world, from rolling stock to signaling, can allow us to purchase higher performance trains that can operate in between freight trains more efficiently, getting us more passenger capacity out of our existing infrastructure. It would also probably be wise for us to reconsider how we govern our rails. In many countries, the infrastructure construction and its management are separated from the actual train companies that operate on that infrastructure, creating a neutral arbiter who can direct rail traffic and help manage disputes, kind of like you have with airports, for example. While almost no country has figured out how to create a North American level of success in freight rail while also providing a European or Asian level of passenger rail quality, we can be the first. Thanks for watching.